The first thing people noticed about Salvatore Testa was how young he looked to be carrying so much weight. Not the kind you could see on his shoulders, but the kind that lived behind his eyes. On quiet Philadelphia evenings, when the city slowed and the streetlights hummed softly, Sal would sometimes stand alone outside a corner cafe, hands in his pockets, listening to the city breathe. He didn't look like a man rushing toward destiny. He looked like someone walking beside it, aware it could turn at any moment. Sal grew up in a world where loyalty was spoken about more than it was explained. His father's name carried respect, and in some rooms, silence. From an early age, Sal learned that words mattered, but actions mattered more. You showed up, you remembered who stood by you, and you never forgot who you were, no matter how fast life started to move. As a boy, he wasn't reckless. He was observant. He watched how adults spoke differently depending on who entered the room. He noticed how favors were remembered long after money was spent. While other kids dreamed loudly, Sal kept his thoughts close, building a quiet understanding of how people worked. He learned early that strength didn't always announce itself. Philadelphia shaped him. The city had a rhythm. Old brick streets, tight neighborhoods, voices that carried history in their tone. Sal felt rooted there. He knew the shortcuts, the faces, the unspoken rules. People recognized him not because he demanded attention, but because he belonged. That sense of belonging would become one of his greatest strengths, and eventually one of his heaviest burdens. As he grew older, expectations followed him like a shadow. Some were spoken gently, others never said aloud at all. Sal understood them anyway. He didn't rush to meet them. He moved carefully, building trust step by step. When he helped someone, he meant it. When he promised something, he followed through. That consistency made people comfortable around him. Comfort, he learned, was powerful. Sal had a way of listening that made people talk more than they intended. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush. He remembered details others forgot. Over time, people began to rely on him, not just for solutions but for steadiness. He became someone others felt safe standing beside. In a world where uncertainty was common, that kind of reliability was rare. Despite the growing attention around him, Sal kept a calm center. He enjoyed simple things. Late-night conversations, shared meals, familiar streets. He laughed easily, but he thought deeply. At night, he replayed conversations in his mind, considering not just what was said, but what was meant. He believed understanding people was more important than trying to control them. As responsibility increased, so did complexity. Choices carried consequences now. Not dramatic ones at first, just small decisions that shaped trust, direction, and reputation. Sal felt the weight of them, but he didn't shy away. He believed that if you were given responsibility, it meant someone trusted you to carry it properly. People began to speak his name with confidence. Not loudly, not carelessly, but with assurance. Sal's solid, they'd say. He'll handle it. That reputation didn't come from force or fear. Came from consistency. From being the same person in every room. From understanding that respect, once earned, had to be protected every day. Still, Sal was aware of the path forming in front of him. He knew it wasn't simple. He knew it demanded balance between loyalty and caution, ambition and restraint. He didn't see himself as larger than the world around him. He saw himself as part of it, responsible for the way his actions rippled outward. On one quiet night, as the city lights reflected off rain-darkened pavement, Sal paused and looked down the street he'd walked 1,000 times. He felt the pull of expectation, the weight of legacy, and the quiet question that followed him. Everywhere. How far could he go without losing himself? The city didn't answer. It never did. But Sal took a step forward anyway. Salvatore Testa didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone important. It happened the way most real changes do. Slowly, quietly, through a series of moments that didn't seem historic at the time. Part 2 begins with him realizing that people weren't just noticing him anymore. They were watching him. The shift was subtle. Conversations paused when he entered a room, not out of fear, but expectation. People waited to see where he would sit, who he would greet first, what expression crossed his face. Sal noticed this and didn't let it show. He understood something most never did. Once people start watching you, every small action becomes a message. He became more deliberate. When he spoke, it was with purpose. When he stayed silent, it was intentional. Sal learned that silence, used correctly, could calm situations faster than raised voices ever could. He had inherited more than a name. He had inherited the ability to read a room and adjust without losing himself. Philadelphia nights became longer. Meetings stretched late not because they had to, but because people trusted Sal to listen. He wasn't there to dominate conversations. He asked questions that made others think. He gave advice without sounding like he was giving orders. That balance made him different. People left those conversations feeling steadier, clearer, like someone had straightened the room without moving the furniture. Still, not everyone approved of his rising presence. Some saw youth where they wanted age. Others mistook calm for softness. Sal knew this too. He didn't rush to correct them. He believed time revealed truths better than confrontation. Let people underestimate you, he thought. It gives you space to move. At home, the weight felt heavier. Legacy wasn't just a public thing. It lived in quiet moments, family dinners, unspoken expectations. Sal respected where he came from, but he didn't want to live as a reflection of anyone else. He wanted to build something that felt earned, not inherited. That internal conflict followed him everywhere, like a second heartbeat. Despite the pressure, Sal stayed grounded. He walked the same streets, greeted the same faces, remembered the same stories. He understood that forgetting where you came from was the fastest way to lose where you were going. People noticed that too. Respect deepened not because he changed, but because he didn't. Opportunities came his way, some tempting, some risky. Sal evaluated each one carefully. He asked himself not just what he could gain, but what it would cost. Reputation, he believed, was a long game. You didn't spend it all at once. You protected it like savings, knowing one careless decision could drain years of work. As his confidence grew, so did his sense of responsibility. Sal felt accountable not just for his actions, but for the people who trusted him. He understood that leadership wasn't about control. It was about stability, about making sure the ground didn't shake when others were standing on it. There were nights when doubt crept in, quiet moments when the city finally slept and Sal was left alone with his thoughts. He wondered how far this path would go, and whether there was a point where turning back wouldn't be possible. But each morning he chose forward, not recklessly, not blindly, but with intention. By the end of this chapter of his life, Salvatore Testa wasn't just a name spoken with confidence. He was becoming a presence, steady, thoughtful, and unmistakably his own. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. The city was beginning to lean in, listening closely to the footsteps he left behind. By the time Salvatore Testa stepped into this next phase of his life, the city no longer saw him as someone rising. To many, he had already arrived. The strange thing was, Sal didn't feel like he'd reached anything at all. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a long bridge, looking across it in the early morning fog, knowing the real walk hadn't even begun. Responsibility came to him in pieces, never all at once. A quiet request here, a delicate situation there. Each one tested not his strength, but his judgment. Sal understood that the real challenge wasn't solving problems. It was solving them in a way that didn't create 3 more behind you. He moved carefully, always asking himself how today's choices would echo months from now. People started coming to him before things got complicated, not after. That was new. It meant they trusted his ability to keep storms from forming, not just to clean up after them. Sal listened more than he spoke, letting others feel heard before offering his perspective. He believed people accepted guidance more easily when they felt respected first. The city itself seemed to reflect his mood. Philadelphia had a way of feeling both intimate and vast at the same time. Old row houses, familiar corners, voices that carried history. Sal moved through it like someone who knew every chapter but understood the story was still being written. He greeted shop owners, nodded to passersby, stayed rooted in the ordinary even as his world quietly expanded. But growth always attracts tension. Some admired his steady rise. Others watched with caution. Sal sensed it in the air. Subtle shifts in tone, longer pauses in conversation, eyes that measured instead of greeted. He didn't take it personally. He knew trust wasn't universal, and respect often came with quiet resistance. He focused on consistency, being the same person in every room, calm when things went smoothly, calmer when they didn't. Sal believed that emotional control was its own kind of strength. Anyone could react. Not everyone could remain composed when it mattered most. At home, the nights were quieter, but his thoughts were louder. Sal reflected on the balance he was trying to maintain between ambition and restraint, loyalty and independence. He wanted to honor the past without being trapped by it. That wasn't easy. Legacy had a way of pulling you backward even as life pushed you forward. He also began to notice something else. People were starting to look to him not just for answers, but for reassurance. A word from Sal could ease concerns, slow tensions, steady nerves. That realization stayed with him. Power, he understood, wasn't always about action. Sometimes it was about presence, about being someone others felt calmer around. There were moments of pride, but they were brief. Sal didn't celebrate victories loudly. He stored them away quietly, like lessons rather than trophies. Each success reminded him that expectations would only grow, and with them, the consequences of missteps. As days turned into months, Salvatore Testa became someone the city relied on without fully realizing it. His name carried weight, but not drama. Influence, but not noise. He was building something fragile yet strong, a reputation based not on fear or flash, but on trust. Late one night, walking alone under a pale streetlight, Sal paused again. He listened to the distant hum of traffic, the soft echo of footsteps, the familiar heartbeat of the city. He knew the path ahead would demand more from him than ever before. And for the first time, he wondered not whether he could handle it, but what it would ask him to give up in return. The answer, like the city itself, remained silent. As Salvatore Testa moved deeper into his role, time seemed to speed up while he stayed steady. Days blurred together, filled with conversations that mattered more than they sounded. Decisions that looked small from the outside but carried weight beneath the surface. Sal learned that influence rarely announced itself. It slipped into routines, into who people called first and who they waited for before moving ahead. He became more selective with his time. Not distant, not cold, just focused. Sal understood that access itself had value, and he didn't want to cheapen it by being everywhere at once. When he showed up, people noticed. When he didn't, they wondered why. That balance gave him room to breathe and room to think. Trust continued to build, but so did complexity. Relationships weren't simple lines anymore. They were webs. A word to one person could echo through others. Sal chose his words carefully, aware that tone mattered just as much as content. He never rushed conversations. He believed patience revealed more than pressure ever could. Philadelphia kept its rhythm around him. The same corners, the same familiar faces, the same streets that had shaped him. Sal made a point to stay connected to the ordinary parts of life. He knew how easy it was to lose perspective when people started treating you differently. So he kept walking the same routes, eating at the same places, reminding himself who he was before expectations followed him everywhere. Yet there were moments when the weight pressed in. Decisions no longer affected just him. They touched friends, families, futures. Sal felt that responsibility deeply. He carried it quietly, never letting it harden him. He believed that leadership without empathy was just control, and control without understanding never lasted. Some nights he talked less and listened more, to the city, to the silence, to his own thoughts. He questioned himself often, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the path he was on. He wanted to be certain that every step forward was intentional, not automatic. People began to mirror his calm. Situations that once might have escalated seemed to settle faster when he was involved. Sal didn't take credit for that. He saw it as proof that steadiness could spread, that composure was contagious. It reinforced his belief that the strongest presence in a room wasn't always the loudest one. Still, there were signs of tension beneath the surface. Subtle shifts, new faces, conversations that felt slightly more guarded. Sal noticed everything. He didn't react, but he adjusted. He believed awareness was the first form of protection. Not suspicion, not fear, just attention. At home, he reflected on how far he'd come. The expectations that once felt distant were now part of his everyday reality. He didn't resent them. He accepted them as part of the road he'd chosen. But acceptance didn't mean blindness. Sal reminded himself often that the future wasn't guaranteed by the past. It had to be earned daily. One evening, as dusk settled over the city and the sky softened into shades of blue and gray, Sal stood near a window and watched the lights come on one by one. Each light represented a life, a story, a set of hopes and worries. He felt connected to all of it, responsible in a way that was hard to explain. He didn't know how the story would unfold from here. He only knew that staying true to himself, calm, thoughtful, consistent, was the only way forward that made sense. The road ahead was narrowing, not closing, but demanding clarity. And Salvatore Testa, steady as ever, took another step forward, fully aware that every step now mattered more than the last. By the time this chapter of Salvatore Testa's life began, the city felt closer than ever and farther too. It was as if Philadelphia leaned in when he passed, listening for something it couldn't quite name. Sal sensed it in the way conversations softened when he entered a room, in the way people waited a beat longer before speaking. The air around him carried expectation now, and expectation had its own gravity. He was trusted with matters that required balance more than force. Situations where one careless word could undo months of calm. Sal approached each one the same way. Slow down, listen fully, respond with intention. He believed urgency was often a disguise for poor judgment. Taking time, even when others were impatient, had become his quiet advantage. What surprised him most was how often people came to him not for solutions, but for reassurance. They wanted to know things would be all right, that tomorrow wouldn't bring chaos. Sal didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. He spoke honestly, carefully, choosing steadiness over certainty. People respected that. They felt grounded leaving his presence, even when answers weren't perfect. Yet with influence came isolation. The circle around him narrowed, not out of fear but necessity. Sal learned that leadership could be lonely, not because people avoided you, but because fewer people truly understood the weight you carried. He accepted that solitude without bitterness. Quiet had always been familiar to him. At home, he reflected on how different life felt from just a few years earlier. The streets were the same, the city unchanged, but his place within it had shifted. He thought often about loyalty, what it meant, how it was earned, how easily it could be tested. Sal believed loyalty wasn't proven in dramatic moments, but in consistency over time. Showing up, staying true, not disappearing when things became uncomfortable. He paid close attention to relationships, nurturing them carefully. A phone call returned promptly. A promise kept even when it was inconvenient. These small acts reinforced trust more than any grand gesture ever could. Sal understood that people remembered how you made them feel, especially when no one else was watching. Still, beneath the calm, there was awareness, a sense that stability was fragile, that maintaining balance required constant attention. Sal didn't fear this reality. He respected it. He knew that complacency was the real danger, not pressure. So he stayed alert, engaged, thoughtful. The city continued to test him in subtle ways. New challenges emerged, each one asking him to choose between the easy path and the right one. Sal consistently chose the latter, even when it demanded patience and restraint. He wasn't interested in shortcuts. He was building something meant to last, even if that meant progress came quietly. Late one night, walking alone beneath a sky washed clean by rain, Sal stopped at an intersection he'd crossed countless times. He realized how much had changed, and how much of himself remained the same. That realization comforted him. It reminded him that while roles evolve, character must remain constant. He took a breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and continued on. The road ahead wasn't clearer, but he trusted his footing. For now, that was enough. Salvatore Testa's world had grown more intricate, each day layering new relationships, new responsibilities, and new expectations atop the ones already in place. By this point, he understood that influence wasn't about presence alone. It was about the echoes your actions left behind. People remembered the quiet decisions more than the loud gestures. They remembered how you made them feel, how you steadied the room without raising your voice, how you acted when no one was looking. That kind of influence carried further than any reputation built on spectacle. Mornings began the same way. Slowly, deliberately, Sal would walk the streets he knew like the back of his hand, observing not just the familiar but the subtle shifts that hinted at unseen changes. A new shopkeeper, a displaced family, a shift in neighborhood dynamics. All of it mattered. He treated these observations as part of a living map, a guide for how to act and whom to trust. Every detail added clarity, and every interaction had meaning, no matter how minor it seemed at first glance. He had learned to listen in ways others did not just to words, but to pauses, gestures, and the unspoken tension in rooms. Conversations often revealed more when left unhurried, and Sal became an expert in drawing out truths without forcing them. People were more open when they didn't feel pressured, more honest when they felt heard. That understanding became a cornerstone of how he navigated both personal and broader community relationships. With this skill came responsibility. Sal's decisions no longer affected only himself. They rippled outward, shaping perceptions, choices, and even the day-to-day comfort of those around him. That weight could have been oppressive, but he embraced it with calm determination. He had grown into someone who could carry burdens without letting them harden him, someone whose steadiness inspired others to feel safe, even in uncertainty. Generosity continued to be a guiding principle, but by now it had evolved beyond simple acts of kindness. Every choice to help, to support, to intervene strategically reinforced bonds in ways that were subtle yet profound. Sal understood that trust and loyalty were cultivated over time, through consistency, thoughtfulness, and attention to details that might seem inconsequential. Each gesture of support had a ripple effect, building networks that were resilient and self-sustaining. Yet life was never without its challenges. Subtle tensions arose. People tested boundaries, motives shifted, and small disagreements threatened to grow. Sal navigated these moments with patience, preferring dialogue and observation over force or reaction. He had learned that conflict was often a signal, not an endpoint. Addressing the underlying issues before they escalated became one of his key strengths. Evenings were a time for reflection. Sal would review the day quietly, considering what had gone well, what required attention, and what opportunities lay ahead. This daily practice honed his foresight, enabling him to anticipate challenges before they materialized and identify paths that others might overlook. Reflection became as much a tool as observation or action. Despite the growing influence, Sal never lost sight of the ordinary. Family, neighborhood connections, and personal rituals reminded him of who he was and why he moved the way he did. These anchors ensured that ambition did not overshadow empathy, that strategy did not erase humanity. He understood that true leadership wasn't about dominance. It was about guiding, supporting, and reinforcing the networks that enabled community to thrive. Observation had become almost instinctive. Sal could sit quietly in a crowded plaza and notice the smallest details, who lingered with whom, which gestures hinted at alignment or tension, which conversations carried the most weight. These insights, though subtle, allowed him to act with precision and confidence. Anticipation became a natural extension of understanding. By night, the city's energy slowed, and Sal synthesized what he had learned. Influence, he realized, was about consistency, reliability, and subtle guidance. People's behaviors could be shaped without overt intervention, through trust, example, and the perception of stability. That kind of influence, durable and quiet, allowed him to navigate complexities with finesse. At this stage, Sal's vision extended beyond immediate outcomes. He thought in terms of systems and networks, considering not just what needed to be achieved now, but how actions today would affect the future. Influence, he understood, was sustainable only when embedded in trust, relationships, and shared understanding. Yet he also knew vigilance was crucial. The stability he had built could be disrupted by neglect or misjudgment. Maintaining balance required constant attention, adaptability, and the humility to acknowledge uncertainty. Sal welcomed the discipline, recognizing it as essential to the longevity of his work. Even in quiet moments, he felt the weight of legacy. Not just the legacy of his family name, but the legacy of how he moved through the city, how he touched lives, and how his decisions rippled beyond his immediate circle. He didn't dwell on recognition. He focused on integrity, on leaving patterns behind that could endure. As the city settled under the night sky, Sal paused on a familiar street corner. He reflected on how much had changed, yet how much remained the same. Streets, faces, rhythms. They were constant, grounding him amidst growing complexity. The weight of influence was heavy, but it was carried with care, intention, and awareness. By the early morning hours, Salvatore Testa had learned that the measure of a person's presence wasn't in dramatic gestures or loud declarations. It was in steadiness, thoughtfulness, and the ability to move through life in a way that left others steadier for having crossed paths with you. Influence, after all, was not taken. It was cultivated. Salvatore Testa's days had begun to take on a rhythm that mirrored the pulse of Philadelphia itself. Each morning brought subtle challenges, each conversation a test of patience and perception. By now, he had become someone whose presence was quietly influential. People looked to him not just for guidance, but for reassurance. There was a rhythm to his life, a flow that allowed him to anticipate needs, understand motives, and respond in ways that maintained balance without drawing attention to himself. He had learned that true influence often lay in restraint. Actions taken without thought could ripple outward, creating unintended consequences. Sal approached every situation like a careful chess player, considering not just immediate outcomes but the unseen impacts that would unfold over days, weeks, or months. He understood that small gestures, repeated consistently, built trust faster than any bold declaration. The city itself seemed to respond to him, not literally, of course, but in subtle ways. Neighbors grew more open, conversations were smoother, tensions diffused before they escalated. Sal noticed these changes with satisfaction, but also with humility. He knew his presence wasn't magic. It was earned through steady consistency, observation, and respect. Even as his networks expanded, Sal remained grounded in the everyday. He visited the same corner, shops, greeted familiar faces, and maintained routines that kept him connected to the ordinary. These moments were a reminder that influence wasn't about distance or separation. It was about understanding the people around you and moving alongside them, not above them. Responsibility weighed on him, though he rarely showed it. Every decision had potential consequences, and missteps could ripple through the lives of many. Sal approached these choices with care, weighing options quietly and often consulting his own instincts before acting. He had learned that foresight was more valuable than speed, and patience often outlasted impulsive ambition. Trust continued to grow, but so did scrutiny. Not everyone welcomed his rise, and some observed him cautiously, measuring his words and actions. Sal didn't see this as a threat. He saw it as a natural part of influence. People tested boundaries, whether consciously or unconsciously, and he had to remain aware, adaptable, and attentive to ensure that the relationships he built remained strong. Evenings were often times for reflection. Sal would consider the day's events, noting moments where he had been effective, where patience had paid off, and where he might have misread a situation. These reflections sharpened his judgment, allowing him to act with greater insight the next day. Influence, he understood, was cumulative. Small missteps could be corrected, but consistency was the key to lasting respect. Relationships remained central to his approach. He nurtured connections not out of obligation, but out of a deep understanding that people were the foundation of any network. A kind word, a timely gesture, or simply showing up when it mattered could solidify bonds that no amount of reputation alone could sustain. Sal valued loyalty, not as a currency, but as a reflection of mutual respect and reliability. Challenges came, as they always do, but Sal's response was measured. He had learned to separate emotion from action, to recognize when pressure required patience and when decisiveness was necessary. This balance allowed him to navigate situations that might have overwhelmed others, maintaining stability even as circumstances shifted unpredictably. He also understood the importance of perception. Influence was not just about what you did, but how people interpreted it. Sal was careful to align action with intent, ensuring that his behavior reinforced trust, steadiness, and integrity. Misinterpretation could erode months of effort, and he treated the perception of his actions with the same care as the actions themselves. As night fell over Philadelphia, Sal would sometimes walk alone, observing the city he had grown up in and now helped shape through his influence. The lights, the streets, the quiet rhythms, they reminded him of the delicate balance between constancy and change, between ambition and responsibility. He knew that his path forward required vigilance, awareness, and careful planning. In these quiet moments, he felt a growing clarity. Influence wasn't about control or fear. It was about presence, consistency, and the ability to guide without overt pressure. It was earned through reliability, strengthened through observation, and preserved through thoughtful action. Sal realized that this understanding would define not just his role in the city, but the way he lived his life. By the early morning, as the city's first sounds began to stir, Salvatore Testa felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He knew that the road ahead would be complex, filled with both opportunity and challenge. But he also knew that his approach, steady, thoughtful, and grounded in trust, gave him the tools to navigate it successfully. Every step forward was intentional, every decision weighed, every connection nurtured. The story of his influence was ongoing, unfolding quietly in the streets, conversations, and relationships around him. Sal had become more than just a figure in Philadelphia. He had become a subtle architect of its rhythms, a steady presence whose choices shaped the lives of those around him in ways both visible and invisible. Salvatore Testa's world had grown quieter on the surface, but inside, the complexity of his life had deepened. He had learned to operate in spaces where tension and opportunity existed side by side, where every gesture carried weight, and every word could influence the outcome of unseen chains of events. By now, his awareness had become almost instinctive, a constant attentiveness to the rhythms of people, places, and moments around him. The mornings were slower, more deliberate. Sal walked the same streets, yet he observed them with a keener eye, noting small changes. A new storefront, a familiar face missing from its usual spot, the subtle signs of unrest in conversation. These observations fed into a growing understanding that the city was alive, constantly shifting, and that influence required not only action but anticipation. By midday, he found himself drawn into discussions that demanded subtlety. People came to him for guidance, not commands. They needed clarity, reassurance, and perspective more than instruction. Sal offered all three without ever forcing his opinion, letting his calm presence steer outcomes naturally. This ability to shape situations quietly became one of his defining qualities. Despite his growing influence, Sal remained deeply connected to ordinary life. He dined at the same familiar restaurants, walked familiar streets, and spoke with neighbors with the same attentiveness he had shown for years. These practices grounded him, reminding him that the essence of his presence was not authority alone, but trust and consistency. People felt safe around him because he never lost sight of who he was. Relationships continued to define much of his work. Sal nurtured bonds carefully, understanding that trust is built slowly and maintained even more deliberately. A gesture of kindness, a word of reassurance, or simply being present at the right time had ripple effects far beyond what most could perceive. He knew that the quiet work of connection often outweighed any overt display of power. The weight of responsibility had increased. Decisions he made had consequences that extended beyond his immediate sphere. But he carried this responsibility with quiet confidence, never letting it harden him or make him rigid. He had learned that influence required flexibility, patience, and the ability to adapt without compromising principles. Evenings were often reflective. Sal would review the day's interactions, considering what had been effective and what required adjustment. This reflection was not about self-critique in a harsh sense, but about understanding patterns, recognizing opportunities, and ensuring that the relationships he cultivated remained strong and resilient. Influence, he understood, was cumulative, built over years through consistent, deliberate action. He began to notice subtle shifts in the people around him. Those who once doubted now watched him with respect. Those who had been indifferent now sought his input. Sal did not let these changes inflate his ego. He knew that influence could be fleeting if it was taken for granted. Constant attention and care were required to maintain it. Observation became both a tool and a shield. Sal could walk into a room and understand the dynamics within minutes. The alliances, the tensions, the unspoken expectations. This ability allowed him to act in ways that were both effective and discreet, resolving potential issues before they escalated and strengthening the bonds of trust quietly but decisively. Generosity remained central to his approach, now more refined. It was not about spectacle or obligation, but about meaningful support that reinforced loyalty and stability. Sal's understanding of human motivation allowed him to provide help in ways that were both subtle and profoundly effective, fostering goodwill without expectation of immediate return. Challenges continued to arise, testing his patience and judgment. But Sal had learned to meet them calmly, evaluating the best path forward rather than reacting impulsively. He had discovered that the greatest strength lay not in domination, but in careful guidance and measured action. Influence, he realized, was most enduring when it could operate without overt control. The nights were times of contemplation. Sal often walked through quiet streets, reflecting on the day, the people he had met, and the choices that lay ahead. The city seemed to breathe with him, its rhythms echoing the patterns he had come to understand so well. He knew that every step forward, every decision, shaped not just his path, but the lives of those around him. By now, Salvatore Testa had become more than just a figure recognized by others. He had become a steadying presence, someone whose careful attention and quiet guidance influenced outcomes without fanfare. His work was subtle, his impact profound, and his understanding of human nature deep and nuanced. He understood that the road ahead would remain complex and unpredictable. But he also knew that his approach, grounded in trust, patience, and thoughtful observation, gave him the tools to navigate it successfully. Every step, every interaction, every decision mattered. As the city settled under a blanket of night, Sal paused to take it all in. He realized that influence was not about force or visibility. It was about consistency, empathy, and the quiet art of shaping the world by understanding it deeply. Philadelphia, with all its energy and unpredictability, had become a canvas, and Sal, with patience and awareness, was painting a subtle, enduring legacy. Salvatore Testa had reached a point where his presence was both quiet and undeniable. The city of Philadelphia seemed to bend subtly to his awareness, not because of overt authority, but because of the steadiness he projected. People felt a kind of unspoken assurance around him, a sense that whatever decisions lay ahead, they could navigate them with confidence if Sal was near. He understood that influence wasn't about being in the spotlight. It was about creating calm in the storm, clarity in confusion, and stability in uncertainty. By this stage, Sal's daily routines were precise yet flexible. Mornings began with observation walks, where he took in the cityscape, the new storefronts, familiar faces, subtle changes in behavior, all forming an internal map that guided his interactions. Each detail mattered. Even the smallest shift in tone or expression could reveal motivations that words alone would never convey. This awareness allowed him to act with foresight, often preventing conflicts before they even had a chance to surface. Conversations remained a central part of his influence. Sal had mastered the art of listening deeply, hearing not just words but the intent behind them. People often underestimated how much they revealed when speaking with him. He asked questions that prompted reflection, encouraged honesty without judgment, and provided guidance subtly, allowing others to feel ownership over their decisions. It was a skill that made him indispensable and trusted, not by force, but by quiet competence. Yet with influence came increased responsibility. Every choice he made carried weight, not just for himself but for those around him. Decisions that seemed minor on the surface could ripple outward, affecting livelihoods, relationships, and reputations. Sal carried this responsibility with calm determination, knowing that missteps could undo years of careful cultivation. He had learned that patience and foresight were his most valuable tools, and he wielded them consistently. The city, as familiar as it was, still held surprises. New challenges emerged, testing his judgment and adaptability. Some were obvious disagreements that required mediation or situations that needed delicate handling. Others were subtle. Changes in alliances, shifts in trust, or hidden tensions that could surface unexpectedly. Sal approached each with the same measured mindset. Observe, listen, understand, act thoughtfully. His ability to remain steady in these moments reinforced the trust people placed in him. Evenings were often a time for reflection. Sal would review the day, noting patterns, outcomes, and interactions that held lessons for the future. Reflection sharpened his foresight, allowing him to anticipate challenges and opportunities with increasing precision. He understood that influence was cumulative. Small, consistent actions built reputations, relationships, and networks stronger than any single grand gesture ever could. Family and personal connections remained anchors in his life. Despite the increasing complexity of his role, Sal never lost sight of the importance of grounded relationships. He maintained routines that connected him to home, community, and the ordinary pleasures of life. These moments of grounding ensured that his growing influence didn't distance him from empathy or understanding, and that he never lost sight of the human elements that gave meaning to his work. Observation had become almost instinctive. Sal could enter a room and immediately sense the dynamics at play, the alliances, tensions, and intentions hidden beneath surface conversation. This skill allowed him to act with precision and discretion, addressing potential issues before they escalated and strengthening the bonds of trust quietly but decisively. Despite the calm he projected, Sal was aware of the fragile balance he maintained. Influence could be lost as easily as it was gained, and trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. He treated every relationship, every interaction, and every decision with care, understanding that longevity depended on consistency, integrity, and attentiveness. As he walked through quiet streets at night, the city seemed to echo his own reflections. Philadelphia, with its rhythms, its familiar corners, and its people, was both a challenge and a canvas. Sal recognized that the work of influence was never complete. It required constant observation, patience, and care. But he also recognized the profound impact of subtle, thoughtful action, and he understood that this impact could extend far beyond immediate results. By the end of this chapter, Salvatore Testa had become more than a figure recognized by others. He had become a presence that shaped the environment around him in ways both visible and invisible. His careful observation, patient guidance, and consistent integrity allowed him to navigate complexity with clarity, and to leave an enduring mark on the city he had grown to understand so intimately. Salvatore Testa's influence had by now become something quietly powerful. People no longer just noticed him, they relied on him. Not because he demanded attention, but because he had shown over years that his presence brought clarity and steadiness. It was a rare quality in a world where chaos often ruled, and those who recognized it valued it more than words could express. By this stage, his life had settled into a rhythm of observation, reflection, and measured action. He moved through the city with awareness, noting even the smallest changes in his surroundings. A new face in a familiar place, a subtle shift in a conversation, the tone of a greeting, each carried meaning. Sal had learned to interpret these signs carefully, understanding that influence often worked through subtle guidance rather than overt direction. Trust had become his most valuable currency. People came to him with questions, dilemmas, and decisions, seeking not just solutions, but reassurance that their choices would be sound. Sal offered his counsel quietly, without imposing himself, allowing others to feel ownership while subtly guiding outcomes toward stability. This approach reinforced loyalty and built connections that were resilient and enduring. Evenings were a time for reflection. Sal considered the day's interactions, noting successes, missteps, and opportunities for growth. He understood that influence was cumulative. Small actions, repeated over time, shaped perception and trust more than any single dramatic gesture ever could. This awareness guided him in both personal and professional relationships, helping him maintain balance while navigating complexity. The city itself felt different now. Philadelphia's streets, familiar yet ever-changing, mirrored the subtle shifts in Sal's life. He recognized that the environment he moved through was part of his work, that maintaining awareness and presence in everyday life was as important as handling significant events. The ordinary, he realized, held extraordinary lessons in patience, observation, and understanding. Despite growing responsibilities, Sal remained grounded. He nurtured family connections, stayed engaged with his community, and maintained routines that connected him to the world outside of influence and expectation. These anchors ensured that his decisions were guided by empathy, not just strategy, and that his presence remained human, approachable, and reliable. Challenges continued, as they always do, but Sal had become adept at navigating them with poise. He met tension with calm, uncertainty with patience, and complexity with thoughtful observation. He knew that reaction without reflection could undermine even the most carefully built trust, so he chose his responses deliberately, reinforcing his reputation for steadiness and insight. By night, walking through quiet streets, Sal would reflect on the road behind him and the path ahead. He understood that influence was not about power or control, but about creating stability, trust, and clarity in a world that often lacked it. Every step he took, every decision he made, shaped not only his own life but the lives of those who looked to him for guidance. In this way, Salvatore Testa had become more than a figure in Philadelphia. He was a steady presence, a quiet architect of relationships and influence, and a man whose consistency and awareness allowed him to navigate complexity with confidence. The city itself seemed to respond to his approach, unfolding around him in subtle ways that reflected the care, patience, and understanding he brought to every interaction. And in those quiet moments, when the city slept and the streets reflected the soft glow of streetlights, Sal understood that the true measure of his life was not in recognition or fame, but in the stability, trust, and subtle guidance he provided to the world around him. A legacy built one deliberate step at a time. As Salvatore Testa moved into this next phase of his life, he began to sense that influence wasn't just about presence or action. It was about timing. There were moments when stepping forward mattered, and moments when waiting, observing, and listening achieved far more than intervention ever could. He had learned that patience was not an action. It was strategic, deliberate, and often transformative. The city continued to reveal its layers to him. Philadelphia was a living entity, and Sal had become attuned to its rhythms. The streets, the corners, the quiet exchanges between neighbors, they all carried messages if one knew how to look. Sal saw patterns in behavior, subtle shifts in alliances, and even changes in mood that signaled larger currents beneath the surface. His ability to interpret these signs became a kind of compass, guiding his decisions and shaping his understanding of the world around him. Trust had deepened further, not just because of what Sal did, but because of how he carried himself. Consistency, calm, and integrity had created a web of relationships that were resilient. People turned to him not for directives, but for reassurance, guidance, and perspective. Sal offered these things quietly, rarely taking credit, understanding that true influence often operated in ways invisible to the casual observer. Yet, with influence came new challenges. People sometimes misread his patience for hesitation, his observation for indifference. Sal had to navigate these perceptions carefully, knowing that misunderstanding could erode even the strongest bonds. He responded with subtle adjustments, demonstrating attentiveness without arrogance, guiding without imposing. Every interaction was an opportunity to reinforce trust and clarity. Evenings offered a different kind of reflection. Sal would review the day's events, consider decisions made, and anticipate challenges on the horizon. Reflection had become an essential part of his practice, sharpening foresight and ensuring that he maintained the equilibrium he had worked so hard to cultivate. Small errors were noted, successes quietly acknowledged, and every observation stored for future reference. Family and community remained his anchor. No matter how complex his responsibilities became, Sal ensured that he remained connected to the people and places that grounded him. Simple acts, a shared meal, a conversation with a neighbor, time spent with family, reminded him of the human context behind every decision, every interaction, and every influence he exercised. Observation had grown into an almost instinctual skill. Sal could enter a room, assess dynamics in moments, and anticipate outcomes with remarkable precision. This ability allowed him to navigate sensitive situations with discretion and efficacy, preventing issues before they escalated and fostering an environment where people felt heard and respected. The balance he maintained was delicate. Influence, he knew, could be lost as easily as it was gained. Every choice required attentiveness, humility, and an understanding of the broader consequences. Sal approached this responsibility with seriousness, knowing that steady guidance was more impactful than fleeting, dramatic gestures. He also began to consider the long-term patterns he was creating. Influence wasn't simply about immediate outcomes. It was about laying foundations that could endure. Through careful observation, consistent behavior, and thoughtful guidance, Sal was shaping networks of trust and stability that would last beyond his own daily presence. Late at night, walking the familiar streets, Sal reflected on how far he had come and how much more remained ahead. He understood that influence, when exercised thoughtfully, was a quiet art that required attention, patience, and empathy. Every interaction mattered, every decision resonated, and every choice contributed to a legacy that was being written in subtle but meaningful ways. By this point, Salvatore Testa had become not just a figure within the city, but a stabilizing force, a presence whose careful guidance and thoughtful observation shaped both people and circumstances. The city's rhythm, its trust, and its connections had become intertwined with his own understanding of influence, creating a tapestry of relationships and stability that reflected the deliberate and measured life he led. Salvatore Testa, at this stage of his life, had become the quiet center around which much of his world seemed to revolve. His influence was no longer measured in actions or decisions alone, but in the subtle way his presence shaped the behavior and mindset of those around him. People moved differently when he was nearby, not out of fear or obligation, but because his calm and consistent approach created a sense of stability and clarity. The mornings continued to follow a deliberate rhythm. Sal walked through familiar streets, noting the smallest details. A new shop sign, a face he didn't recognize, the tone of conversation drifting from a nearby cafe. Each observation fed into an intricate understanding of the city and the people within it. He had learned that awareness was as powerful as action, recognizing shifts before they became problems allowed him to guide situations with precision and discretion. Interactions became exercises in careful listening. Sal had mastered the art of giving others space to speak, encouraging them to reveal not just facts but intentions and concerns. People trusted him because he demonstrated patience and empathy, responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. This trust was invaluable, and Sal treated it with the utmost care, knowing that it could take years to build and moments to lose. Even as responsibilities grew, he maintained his personal grounding. Time spent with family, quiet conversations with neighbors, and small routines provided a stabilizing counterbalance to the complexity of his public influence. These moments reminded him of the human context behind every decision, every interaction, and every relationship he nurtured. Influence without humanity, he had learned, was hollow. Challenges were constant but manageable. Misunderstandings arose, loyalties were tested, and tensions surfaced in ways that required both observation and action. Sal met these moments with the calm he had cultivated over years, assessing each situation carefully and choosing responses that reinforced trust and clarity. He had learned that patience and foresight were far more effective than immediate reaction. Evenings became times of reflection. Sal would revisit the day's events, considering both successes and potential missteps. Each reflection reinforced lessons learned, sharpened foresight, and refined his approach. Influence, he understood, was cumulative and required continuous attention. Small adjustments, applied consistently, had a far greater impact than dramatic gestures made in haste. By night, Philadelphia seemed to mirror his own careful balance. The familiar streets, the quiet corners, and the soft glow of streetlights created a rhythm that matched his own. Sal appreciated these moments of solitude, understanding that the most profound influence often operates quietly, in ways invisible to the casual observer. He also began to think about the future, not in terms of personal gain, but in terms of legacy. The relationships he nurtured, the trust he built, and the patterns of consistency he established were all part of a larger tapestry. Sal recognized that influence could endure beyond immediate presence if cultivated thoughtfully and ethically. Through all of this, Sal maintained his humility. He never allowed recognition or reputation to dictate his actions. He focused on the substance of decisions, the quality of relationships, and the integrity of his guidance. Influence, he knew, was not about prominence but about creating stability, trust, and understanding in the world around him. By the end of Part 12, Salvatore Testa had become a quietly transformative presence, a man whose careful observation, steady guidance, and consistent integrity shaped the lives of those around him in ways both visible and unseen. The city itself seemed to respond to his approach, reflecting the patience, awareness, and empathy he brought to each interaction. And so, in the soft glow of the Philadelphia night, Sal understood that the truest measure of his life was not in accolades or recognition, but in the lasting stability, trust, and thoughtful guidance he provided to the world around him. A legacy quietly written, step by deliberate step. Salvatore Testa had walked the streets of Philadelphia so often that they felt like extensions of himself. Every corner, every familiar building, every quiet alley seemed to hold a memory, a lesson, or a subtle reminder of the life he had lived and the path he had chosen. By now, he understood that influence was not about grand gestures or recognition. It was about presence, patience, and the careful shaping of the world around him. As he moved through the city, he reflected on the years behind him, the challenges, the decisions, the relationships that had grown and evolved. He had learned to listen more than he spoke, to observe more than he acted, and to guide with a quiet hand rather than an imposing one. This approach had allowed him to earn the trust of those around him, to maintain stability in times of uncertainty, and to leave a mark that was lasting but understated. In the evenings, when the city slowed and the streets glowed under the soft light of lamps, Sal would often pause to take it all in. He saw the lives unfolding around him. Families returning home, neighbors greeting each other, the city quietly breathing in rhythm with its people. He understood that his influence was part of this larger tapestry, woven into the daily lives of those who trusted him, respected him, and learned from his example. Even in quiet moments of reflection, Sal recognized the fragility of influence. Trust could be lost as easily as it was earned, and clarity could be clouded by misunderstanding or haste. That was why he approached each day deliberately, choosing his words carefully, observing the world around him attentively, and acting with the foresight that had defined his approach for years. Family and community remained central anchors in his life. Though the weight of responsibility had grown over time, Sal never allowed it to distance him from the human connections that mattered most. He nurtured relationships with care, understanding that loyalty, respect, and understanding were built over years, not in a single moment. These relationships were his legacy, as enduring as any achievement or recognition. In the quiet of the night, Sal allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. He realized that the journey he had taken, the patience, the reflection, the careful guidance, had created a life that mattered in ways beyond his own understanding. His presence had steadied others, his counsel had guided them, and his integrity had inspired respect. That was the measure of success, he thought, not power or prominence, but the enduring stability and trust one leaves behind. Salvatore Testa had become a man who understood the delicate balance of influence, the responsibility of trust, and the power of consistency. He knew that life would always be filled with unforeseen challenges, but he also knew that by staying grounded, observant, and compassionate, he had shaped a path that others could follow with confidence. And so, as the city settled into the quiet rhythm of night, Sal walked on, steady, deliberate, and fully aware that his legacy was written not in grand gestures, but in the countless small actions, choices, and connections that had created a life of quiet, enduring impact. The story of Salvatore Testa ends here, not with fanfare, but with the calm, lasting imprint of a life lived with purpose, patience, and integrity. The story is complete,